Okay, I think we should start. It's 1 minute past 4 UK time. So let's get started. Thank you for joining this session of the Virtual Seminars of Economic Theory. Today we have Wioletta Dziuda from the University of Chicago, who is going to present the paper Voters and the Policy Stability versus Responsiveness Trade-off. We are very pleased to have our guest panelists here, Julia Ersalan and Alessandro Riboni. Just to remind you, the format of the seminar is as follows. We have a 60-minute presentation with time for interim questions from the panelists. This is followed by the 15-minute session for questions and discussion. We request all attendees to keep your microphones muted during the talk. However, please post comments and questions in the chat. If you feel like you may also interrupt and ask questions, and I'm sure either us or Viola will handle that. There will be another opportunity to ask questions live as well in the Q&A sessions at the end. This talk is recorded. Before I hand over to Viola, let me remind you that this seminars take place every Thursday at 4 p.m. UK time. Next week we'll have with us Doron Ravid from Chicago as well, but different department, I think, who will present learning before trading on the inefficiency of ignoring free information. As usual, you can find more information on website and by following us on Twitter. Thank you, Viola.
Thank you.
Presentation is yours now.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for coming. This is a joint work with Antoine Lepper, who has been my longtime co-author. And this paper actually is yet another paper in a line of papers that we have on similar topics, which deal with a basic question. Do policies change over time in an optimal way? So we recognize that circumstances change, economic circumstances change, political circumstances change. And because of this change, voters desire change in policies. And the question is, will this change come at the right time? Will we have too much policy change or too little? And in this particular paper, we're going to ask this question in a particular setting. So the first feature of the setting will be that we're going to assume that the voter cares about two things. On the one hand, she cares about policy being responsive to shocks. So for example, if we have a financial crisis, the voter will desire different tax policy than when we have time as usual or when we have an economic boom. At the same time, we're going to assume that voter cares about policy stability. And this is going to be the novel assumption that we're making here, in a sense that we have ignored this in our work so far. And here we want to understand how this policy stability actually plays out in the policy-making process. So because this policy stability is the new thing that we introduced into our model and it will drive all the results that we have, I'm just going to spend a minute trying to convince you that this is an important feature. So of course, if you think about tax system or tax rates, all else equals, voters would like taxes to be relatively stable because every adjustment to the tax system requires costly adjustment from the voters, from the companies, from the taxpayers. But it's not only simple examples like this. Here's another example that we found in 2019. Let me read you this quote. The world's largest automakers warned President Trump on Thursday that his plan to weaken tailpipe pollution standards threatens to cut their profits and produce untenable instability in the crucial manufacturing sector. In a letter signed by 17 companies, the automakers asked Mr. Trump to go back to the negotiation table and on the planned rollback of one of President Barack Obama's signature policies to fight climate change. So what this quote is saying is basically saying that even if the policy change is sort of in the direction in which someone would like to have, if those policy changes happen too frequently, then this is not a desirable feature. Okay. So we are going to start with this assumption. And additionally, we are going to assume that voters don't make decisions on their own. They delegate policymaking to parties. And here we're going to look at an environment in which, first of all, parties are more informed than the voters. And, that creates the need for delegation. And we think it's a reasonable setup. And we also assume that parties may not share voters' preferences. Okay, so voters will have some delegation problem where they have to choose whom to delegate the power to, even though no one will really see eye to eye with the voter. We're going to allow voters to be strategic, so parties to be strategic, so parties might decide to behave the way voter wants, but their intrinsic preferences will be different. Okay, so this is basically going to be our world that we try to understand, and then we're going to ask the following questions. So the first question we're going to ask is, what's voters' electoral behavior? How does she choose parties when she faces this trade-off between policy stability and policy responsiveness? The second question, a natural question that comes up then, is, do elections discipline the parties? Are they going to behave more in line with what the voter wants, or are they going to do something even stranger? And finally, we go back to this question that we started with, that we are interested in many of our papers, which is, are policies responsive to shocks? Are they too stable in equilibrium? Are they too volatile in equilibrium? Okay. Just to give you a preview in case you do fall asleep, despite of what Max said. So what do we find? So of course, because I'm assuming that parties do not see eye to eye with the voter, of course, we're going to have some delegation distortions. So voter will sometimes find herself in a situation in which the policies inefficiently stay in place from her point of view, and sometimes policies will inefficiently change from her point of view. So this is nothing super surprising given the environment we're looking at. The second finding is already more interesting. We are going to find that facing those delegation distortions, the voter will tend to elect the party that's more likely to leave the status quo unchanged. Okay, so if you think about taxes, in the US, the Republicans are usually in favor of lower taxes, Democrats are in favor of higher taxes. So the finding will be that if we have high taxes, Democrats are more likely to be elected, and if we have low taxes, Republicans are more likely to be elected. And we'll call this a status quo bias. And the most interesting thing from our perspective is what follows next. What incentives the status quo bias presents for the parties. We show that these electoral incentives actually exacerbate delegation distortions. So parties will behave less in line with voters' preferences, okay? And in equilibrium, policies will be too unresponsive to the shocks, but at the same too volatile. So they will change even though the shocks to the environment don't call for a policy change. Okay. And finally, we show that these delegation distortions, this extra unresponsiveness and volatility of policies is going to arise, especially in the environments in which the voter is least informed. So in the environments in which she actually really needs to delegate policymaking to the parties. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me jump to the model. I'm going to have the representative voter. I call her M, and I'm going to have two parties, L and R. Okay. I'm going to assume a game that plays out in discrete time. There will be infinite horizon, and everyone will have a discount rate, delta. I'm going to drastically simplify the state space, a policy space, sorry. So I'm going to assume that there are only two policies, left and right. Okay, and at the end of the talk, if we have time, we can discuss what I'm losing by this and what we know about when I'm relaxing this assumption. But for now, there are only two policies, left and right. I'm going to assume that voter will observe a signal. In each period T, she will observe a signal ST. And you can view it as a noisy signal of a state of the world. Parties will observe state of nature, theta T. And I'm going to assume the following relationship. So theta T is equal to ST plus epsilon. So what the state of nature is equal to the signal that the voter observes plus some additional noise. So there are two interpretations of that. Is voter just observes a noisy signal of the state of nature. All the state of nature is realized, So the state of nature is realized. Oh, sorry, let me just forget about what I'm saying. So basically, you have the mathematical expression here. So the parties observe the state of nature, and the voter only observes a noisy signal of the state of nature. And here I'm going to make some technical assumptions. I'm going to assume that S and epsilon are independent over time and from each other. So that's an assumption made for tractability and simplicity. I'm assuming that they admit PDFs, F and G. I'm going to assume that F and G are symmetric around 0, because as you will see, I'm going to focus on symmetric equilibria. They give us the most intuition about what's going on in this world. And I'm going to assume that they're with full support. And the final assumption that I'm making is that G is log concave, which basically means that the higher the signal that the voter sees, the higher her expectation of the state. So nothing unusual here. Okay, so how does the game play out? So in each particular period, each particular period will start with a status quo, and that's going to be the policy that was implemented in the previous period. I'm going to assume that then voter observes the signal, and then she votes. And she can vote either for party L or party R. After the elections are resolved, the elected party will observe the state and implements a policy. And here the policy can be L or R. Okay, so a very simple game within a period. And this repeats itself over and over again, where the elected policy in period T becomes the status quo for period T+1. So what are the payoffs? I'm going to normalize the payoff from L to 0 for all players and all states. And the payoff from R will be a function of the state and some ideological component. So a payoff from policy R of player I in period T will be just the state in T plus some bias BI. Okay, so the higher the state, the more this player likes R over L. And I'm going to, at least for the talk, I'm going to make assumptions that allow me to have this model symmetric. So I'm going to assume that the bias of the party right is just on the opposite side of the bias of the party left. And I'm going to denote it by B. And I'm going to center the voter at 0. So the voter doesn't have any bias, if you will. And I'm going to call party L party ideologically aligned with policy L, and party R party ideologically aligned with policy R. So here I'm not putting any restrictions on those biases. Those parties might be arbitrarily close to the voter or arbitrarily far away, but no matter where they are, my assumptions imply that if party R or the median voters prefer L, so does party L. So in essence, party L is more aligned, more likely to prefer L than anyone else. That's why I call her ideologically aligned. Finally, I'm going to assume two things. First of all, that there's a cost of policy change. So this is like a very simple way to model preference for policy stability. We can talk a little bit later about what would be other ways, and I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. But we are just going to start with the simplest assumption that every player in this game, all else equal, would prefer to leave the status quo unchanged. So basically, every time the policy changes from the status quo to the other policy, everyone incurs a cost C. Okay. And finally, I'm assuming that parties also might be office motivated. So as you see in my model, parties are policy motivated. They get utility from policies, and that was here. But I also allow them to be office motivated. So each of them receives a payoff O if they are in office. And that's it. What's my equilibrium concept? I'm going to focus on Markov perfect equilibria. And for the talk, for most of the talk, I'm going to look at symmetric stationary Markov perfect equilibria because they give us the most intuition about the model. But in the paper, we have a lot to say about asymmetric equilibria as well. Have any questions about the model, like clarifying questions? No?
Sorry, you had the subscript M, and I missed that. You had R and L. This I understand, but M?
The voter, median voter.
Median
voter, yes, yes. Okay, so I'm going to start analyzing this game by looking at a one-shot game first. And it's, it's a very simple analysis, of course, it's in a one-shot game, but it gives you a lot of intuitions for what's going to happen in the dynamic game. So let's suppose that we just play this game once. So there's a status quo in place, there's election, then the elected party implements the policy and the game ends. So what would happen here? So this is a line that represents the state space. Suppose the status quo is L, the leftist policy is in place. Recall that the median voters' preferences are centered at 0, so on average she doesn't have any bias, but because she has this cost of policy change, she will prefer to change the status quo L to R only if the state is relatively high, higher than this cost of policy change. So what you see here with the dashed line, these are the preferences, this is the utility of the median voter from changing the utility to policy, so from changing the policy to policy R, okay? So it's going to cross the state space at C. Okay, so if the voter were the policymaker, this is the set of states in which she would elect to change the status quo to R. Now we have parties. How do they behave? Well, in the static game, they don't have any forward-looking incentives, so they just follow their preferences. If we look at party L has a bias B, but this party also takes into account the cost of policy change. So she will implement a policy change to R if the state is higher than B plus C. Okay, nothing super interesting. And the same happens for party R. Now party R is more biased in favor of right, so she's more likely to implement right than anybody else. But again, she also incurs this cost of a policy change. So this is her behavior. So now let's think about the problem of the voter who knows that this is how the parties are going to behave. Well, she realizes that no matter whom she selects, she's going to have an inefficiency. So for example, if she selects party R in this set of states here, yeah, it doesn't work super well. The policy will change inefficiently because party R is more inclined to abandon the status quo L than the median voter. On the other hand, if she selects party L, she's going to likely to experience inefficient stability. This party will leave policy L in place for longer, for more states than what the voter would want. So that's nothing surprising. We have these two losses that the voter faces, and now she just has to decide, she just has to choose whom to elect to minimize these losses. And that will depend on the signal that she gets, okay? So for example, here I draw a distribution of the state that she will have in her mind if she gets a signal 0. Okay, so if she gets a signal 0, she expects the state to be at 0, but there's some distribution still left for her. And in this picture, when you look at it long enough, what do you see here? You see that the probability of the inefficient policy change when R is elected is higher than the probability of the inefficient stability if L is elected. So in other words, she's more likely, given this signal, she's more likely to disagree with party right, than with party left. So in this case, she chooses party right. So note that when she gets a signal that's sort of consistent with her prior, she selects the party. Did I say it right? I think I said it right. So which party will she select? Let me just repeat it in case I missed it. So because she's more likely to disagree with party right than with party left, she's going to select party left. So she's going to select the party that's ideologically aligned with the status quo. And now you can repeat this exercise a few times, and you see that as long as the state is to the left of C, that's going to be her choice. She's going to select party L. As soon as her signal is at C, she starts being indifferent between those parties. And when the signal is above C, she's going to prefer party right. Okay, so she's more likely, so if you see for all the signals lower than C, she's going to select the party that's aligned with the status quo. So if you repeat this exercise for the other status quo right, you're going to get that the voter exhibits a status quo bias. So for all signals between -C and C, she elects the party that's ideologically aligned with the status quo. So whom she elects depends on the status quo, and she elects the party who is more likely to leave the status quo in place. Okay. Now, before I move on, I just want to make a small note. So this might seem super obvious, given that we assume that there's this preference for stability, but we find it interesting. So I just want to point it out to you that the fact that I have this status quo bias is a combination of the cost of policy change, but also the assumption we make about shocks to the environment. So here I have single peaked utility function, but for example, if I had a uniform distribution here with a wide range, you would see that actually voter would be always indifferent between the parties. And in that, if I had some sort of single dipped distribution in a relevant range, the voter would actually exhibit the opposite of status quo bias. So our result is a combination of the fact that there's a cost of policy change, and also that, as it is standard to assume, when I get a signal, I expect shocks to be smaller, that I expect that smaller shocks are more likely than larger shocks. Okay. So I expect that my signal is closer to the truth than further away from the truth. Okay. So a few observations here that are going to be useful for the dynamic model. So as I said, we have these two types of delegation inefficiencies: inefficient policy stability and inefficient policy change. And both can occur in equilibrium. And finally, a few things. The status quo bias doesn't depend on whether the voter is informed or not. It's always this interval between -C and C. Of course, the probability that the voter gets a signal in this range will depend on what I assume about what the voter knows, but this range is non-zero no matter how informed the voter is. The status quo bias will increase in the cost of policy change. It's completely independent of how far away the parties are. Of course, the voter doesn't like the parties to be far away, but her status quo bias is independent of that. But all these inefficiencies that I'm talking about will disappear, of course, when the parties become closer to the voter. Okay, so nothing super surprising. And nothing in this model here depends on the office motivation because it's a static model. So those are, obvious things that come out from the static model, but they will sort of change, or they will inform us a little bit about what happens when we move to the dynamic model. So let's move to the dynamic model. So what happens in the dynamic model? Well, so let's think about it. Suppose again that the status quo is L. So let's think about the preferences of party L. When will this party change the status quo? Well, she compares her utility from choosing policy R. So it's the policy payoff minus the cost of changing the policy. And she compares this to the utility that she gets from choosing policy L, which is 0. But now the party is forward-looking, so she has a continuation value from choosing a given policy. Now, what does the continuation value depend here on? Because I assume IID-ness of the shocks, and the elections happen every year, the only state variable for the party is what policy she implements in this period. Okay, so the continuation game, how the game will be played out later on depends on whether later on the status quo will be right or the status quo will be left. So I'm denoting the continuation value by W of R and W of L. So that's the only change from the static model. And now if I rearrange those terms, I get that party L behaves like she would in the static model, but then she has this additional term that changes the threshold at which she switches from one status quo, from one policy to another. So the model actually has a pretty clean structure. All I have to do right now is to figure out, like I see that I will have an equilibrium in which parties have a threshold decision rule. They change the status quo if and only if the state is above certain threshold. And all I have to figure out is what is this threshold. So I'm going to denote this, this additional term here for party L as policymaking distortion. I'm going to denote it by WL, and I'm going to put a superscript sigma because in each equilibrium, there might be multiple equilibria, and those distortions might be different in different equilibria. Okay. So now let me just remind you this picture. So this was the picture from the static model. This was the behavior of the parties in the static model. So now basically what I'm telling you is that their behavior will be the same, but will be shifted somehow, you know, either to the left or to the right. And because right now I'm focusing on symmetric equilibria, my question, my sort of first order question is, will this behavior, will the parties move further away from each other or move closer towards each other? Okay, so here's the first proposition. A symmetric equilibrium exists. In any such equilibrium, sigma, voter exhibits status quo bias for exactly the same set of states as in the static model. Voter doesn't have any dynamic distortions. Her preferences are as in the static model. Parties, however, do. The distortion that party L faces is negative, and the distortion that party R faces is positive. So before I force you to think about what that means, let me show you a picture. So basically this inequality in the last bullet point means that in equilibrium parties move further away from the median voter. So the median voter has the same preferences and the parties move further away from her. So what's the intuition here? Well, the intuition here comes exactly from the static model. So in the static model, we have the status quo bias that sometimes the voter ignores the status quo and follows just the state if the state strongly says that policy right is better or policy left is better. But for some intermediate signals, the voter elects the party that's aligned with the status quo. Parties realize that, and that gives an incentive to distort their policy making in favor of the policy that makes them more likely elected. So the rightist party distorts her policy making in favor of right, and the left is in favor of left. So what do we get here? We get that parties polarized, but that also means that both delegation distortions get exacerbated. So if you remember, you know, this area here between minus B plus C and C, okay, it doesn't look super well now. This was the delegation distortion if we elect party misaligned with the status quo, and that becomes bigger. And also the delegation distortion to the other party also becomes bigger. So at the same time, policies become less responsive to the environment, but they also become too volatile. They change too much with the change of who is in power than what the state of nature would require.
Wioletta, it's Alessandro here. Hi. May I ask you, what's the role of the symmetry of information in this? I mean, I read the paper because I'm as a panelist, but if maybe you can clarify what is the role of asymmetric information here? Why do you need it, and what would it change in this picture?
Okay, so there are two reasons why we have this asymmetry. So you're asking why does voter know less than the parties?
Yeah, well, I'm asking what do we get by adding these extra layers in this proposition?
Yeah, so I think I have like 3 answers or maybe 2 answers. So the first one is it's just we thought it was more realistic. The second of all, so note that if voter knew the state of nature, we wouldn't have these delegation distortions. because even though the parties don't see eye to eye, either everyone agrees which in this simple world, in which this simple world with two policies only, either everyone agrees which policy should be implemented, or the parties disagree. And then the voter would just pick the party that implements the policy that she wants at the given state. So there wouldn't be any delegation distortions here. Okay, so in that sense, the model would be less interesting, because yes, we could see, we will see parties that polarize, but that wouldn't really harm the voter in any way. Does it make sense? So if as a voter, I know what's the state, I know whether I want policy left or policy right. And now either the state is such that everyone agrees, so it doesn't matter whom I elect, or the state is such that someone disagrees here, but if parties disagree, I can then pick the one which agrees with me. It's never the case that no party agrees with me as a voter. So I don't really have delegation distortions, and you know, the model becomes sort of not super interesting. Then you get exactly the same results, but they don't have any like interesting meaning.
Okay.
And the
Can I
third
ask
answer,
another question?
yeah, let's just say, and the third answer is that we thought it would be interesting to have comparative statics with respect to how informed the voter is. And yeah, Julia?
So another comparative statics question. Delta, I guess, captures the frequency of the elections, and it has a direct effect, obviously, but also through W, the continuation payoffs, it has an effect. Any thoughts on how?
Yes, so I'm going to have a comparative statics in a second, yes, on delta. I'm going to, if I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about the frequency of elections. If we wanted to measure frequency, to measure frequency of election, we would like to disentangle this from delta, because here the elections happen every time the state is withdrawn. So that's what sort of determines that elections happen every period, independent of how big the delta is. If I want to vary the frequency of elections, I would have to say, you know, the elections happen every 3 withdrawals, let's say, or every 5 withdrawals. Okay, so I wouldn't want to interpret delta here as the frequency of elections per se.
So I'm not sure I get that, because the in-between draws are also would then be affecting the payoffs. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is if you think about the frequency of elections, changing the frequency of elections, you are changing two things. You know, how much I care about the next election, because how far away this election is in the future. So that's changes in delta, but it also changing the frequency of election means also that I'm changing how many times the state will change within the electoral cycle.
I suppose that corresponds to when you elect, they choose policy only once, the parties, whereas they could be electing 3 times every year. If you elect them 4 years, and then every year they change, they pick up policy, and your payoff would be the.
Exactly. Okay. So when we start thinking about electoral cycles, we actually relax the assumption of you know, once I elected, how many times this party will need to make decisions because the state changes. But yeah, let me jump then to this comparative statics that you asked about. So the first thing, the first comment is just technical. Even though here in the talk I'm focusing on the symmetric equilibria, there might be multiple equilibria, and the reason is very simple. You know, so each party is policy motivated. So each party cares who is in office, not only because they get this office motivation, but they cares who makes policies when in office. So we might have equilibria where these distortions are relatively small, but then if I change the beliefs of one party and this party thinks that the other party is distorting their decision-making by a lot, now it becomes very important for this party to be in power, because this party doesn't want the other crazy party making decisions. So as a result, by changing beliefs, I can create an equilibrium where both parties distort their decision-making by a lot. So even the symmetric equilibria can be multiple, and they will be ordered in how much distortions we have. But still we can do comparative statics on the least distorted and the most distorted equilibrium. And this is what I'm going to do. So in either least or most distorted equilibrium, these distortions increase, meaning parties become further away from the median voter as parties become more ideologically misaligned. So as ideological bias increases, as the cost of policy change increases, and as parties become more patient. And here the logic really comes from, you know, this static model and the status quo bias. If parties are more ideologically misaligned, as I said, they care more about them being in office and not the other party because they care about policymaking. So they are more likely to implement the policy that increases their probability of being elected. Similarly, if the cost of policy change increases, we know that the status quo bias increases. The voter has more signals now under which she just falls back on what's the status quo when making her electoral decisions. So parties recognize that and then they polarize more. And finally, the patience, here the patience of the parties actually only matters, not the patience of the voters, but the patience has exactly the same effect. If party is patient, they care about being in office in the next period. So they are more focused not on the current status, on the current state, but they're more focused on which status quo will make them elected in the future. Okay, make sense? Okay, and we can also do welfare, and the welfare decreases in all these parameters. So, you know, that the welfare decreases in the first two parameters is not super surprising. That welfare decreases with patience, you know, that's something that I think, you know, you need the model to come up with. And it's sort of interesting that the more patient the parties are, the worse actually, the worse of the voter is. Okay, so now I'm going to do comparative statics that, you know, I've selected comparative statics here that we think is like the most interesting. So the first one will be on voters' information. So this is going back to Alessandro's question. We were interested in, you know, if voter is little informed, so that's the situation where it makes sense to delegate policymaking to parties, even though parties are biased relative to the voter. And we were interested in, is this actually a situation in which all these distortions are the smallest or the largest? And here's what we get. So fix the distribution of the state and consider the least or most distorted equilibrium sigma in a game with somewhat informative signals. So the game that I just presented to you. And then consider the least or most distorted equilibrium sigma hat in a game in which the signal is uninformative. So here I'm assuming that the voter actually has no information. She always gets the same signal 0 with probability 1. And what I can show is that the distortion in the latter game are higher than the distortions in the former game. So it is exactly when the voter is uninformed, so she really would like to delegate policymaking to the parties distort their behavior the most. And again, the intuition comes from the static model. You know, if the voter is uninformed, she always exhibits status quo bias. She always selects the party that's aligned with the status quo. So that gives the highest incentives for the parties to actually disregard the state and just implement the status quo that will get them elected. Okay, so these are basically the main findings of the paper, but then we sort of ask a question about office motivation. So we realized that, you know, there's this long literature in political economy, political science on, you know, whether elections discipline parties, and in general, with some exceptions, but in general, there's this finding that office motivated parties are good for the voters because they will, you know, the electoral competition will make them try to cater to the voters' wishes because they really want to be elected. They don't care about policies. And on the other hand, if parties are policy motivated, that actually is bad for the voters. We might not get convergence to the voters' preferences because parties also care about policies. So we wanted to ask a question: what happens in this model? So here's what we do. So the first thing is we do comparative statics on the equilibrium distortions with respect to office motivation. And we get that in the least distorted equilibrium, these distortions increase in office motivation, and the welfare of the voter decreases in office motivation. So this is the opposite of what most of the literature finds. And the reason for that is very obvious. Like, if I care about being in office, I'm more likely to disregard the current state, and I'm more likely to just implement the policy that gets me elected. Okay.
Wioletta, I have a quick question. You in the proposition, you also have the most distorted equilibrium. This also happens, right? So in words, you emphasize the least, but
yes.
So it happens in both.
Yes. Yes.
Any thoughts on in other equilibria? Could it
happen? So usually what you have is, so if you have 3 equilibria, then the middle one will have the opposite comparative statics. And if you have more, then it's like every second equilibrium has, you always have the odd number of equilibria, and every second equilibrium will have a different comparative statics. But that's like a feature of games with multiple equilibria, and there's nothing we can do that. And like, you can make some arguments why the middle. So, why do we care about this comparative statics? So first of all, the equilibria in the middle are usually unstable in some sense. And here, like depending on, you can make many formal arguments for instability, but also in symmetric equilibria, the one with least distortions is the welfare optimal equilibrium. So that could be another reason to focus on this equilibrium. Okay, so what we did here is we say, let's just do the following exercise. Let's say that parties are office. So in our model, parties are both office and policy motivation. So we want to disentangle this a little bit, and we want to say, so let's just say that parties are office motivated and make the policy motivation as small as possible. So let's make the parties as similar to the voter as possible. So if you were very careful, initially I made an assumption that B is greater than O. Now I have to flip this assumption. We can talk about why I'm doing this. I'm not hiding anything. Everything that I'm going to say is going to be right. So later on you can ask me, but I just have to relax this assumption now. So what's the proposition? So fix the office motivation and let BK be a sequence of biases that go to 0, and let WK be a sequence of the corresponding policy-making distortions. So for any BK, you have equilibria, pick one equilibrium and call the distortions in this equilibrium WK. So that gives you a sequence of the corresponding policy-making distortions. And what we can show here is that those WKs are bounded away from 0. So even if I'm making the parties more and more aligned with the status, with the voters' preferences, but I'm keeping office motivation, the equilibrium distortions will be bounded away from 0. So even in the limit, I'm going to have 2 parties that behave differently than what the voter wants. And again, the intuition is exactly coming from the static model, because there's the status quo bias. And because parties are office motivated, one party will have an incentive to defend R as the status quo, and the other party will have an incentive to defend L as the status quo. So they will not do policy making in the way that the voter would like them to. And a caveat on the side here, actually, I don't have to restrict myself to symmetric equilibria. This happens in any equilibrium that you can look at. Okay. So office motivation seems to be bad for voters in this model. And I already talked a little bit about the literature. So finally, we decided to do one more. exercise with this office motivation. So we say, okay, so if office motivation makes parties actually polarize, move away from the voter, what happens if we have parties that are differently office motivated? So will voter punish the parties which are known to be office motivated because the voter will realize that they have more incentives to polarize? So here we consider the game, we simplify the game, we say just the voter is always uninformed. So the signal of the voter is always 0. And for this game, let's the probability of P conditional on Q be the probability that P is elected under Q. So party P is elected when the status quo is Q. And here what we can say is, suppose that party R is more office motivated. So we show that when the status quo is L, party L is elected. So we have the status quo bias for party L as we would have in the symmetric model. But I've deleted one line. I don't know why. But this is no longer true for party R. The probability that party R is elected condition on R might be smaller than 1. And in particular, the second bullet point says that as I make the party R more and more office motivated, the probability that this party is elected goes to 0. So indeed, in equilibrium, the voter will elect the party that's aligned with the party that's more office motivated less and less in equilibrium than she would in the symmetric game. Okay, so office motivation is electorally damaging. And one interesting thing that I still, this is like a new thing that we realized, so I don't know what to do with it, but it's interesting. Even though as party R becomes more office motivated, and this party is less likely to be elected, the probability that policy R is implemented initially increases with the office motivation, because what happens is there's this party that's office motivated. So maybe I have a little bit less incentive to elect it because I know that this party distorts its behavior in a way that I don't like. But because this party distorts its behavior in favor of right, if this party is in power, this party implements right more frequently. So actually, even though the party is damaged electorally, in terms of the policies that they initially implement more and more of this policy. Okay, so well, so those are the findings that we found the most interesting, and I could stop here. Let me just mention, I have 10 minutes. Let me just briefly mention what other things we are doing in the paper, just in case you have some comments for us of, oh, this is interesting, or like, no, skip it, or So let me just tell you a few things. So we think about the question that Julia mentioned, the value of elections. So should we have elections? And if we have elections, should we have them frequently? So here we have only partial results, but let me just mention them to you. So we asked 2 questions. So first of all, the voter would like to delegate decision-making to the parties because she's uninformed, but then she faces this effect that parties behave differently than she does. So the question is, that one can ask is, does the voter prefer elections to being a sole decision maker? So for that, we just consider a game in which the voter makes decisions every period, but she's partially informed only, and compare it to the game that we just discussed. And then we also wonder about, how frequent the elections should be. And here we just, look at the extreme case. Suppose that we compare the game in which we have elections with every period to a game in which actually we have elections only once. So we compare our game to the voter selecting one party at the beginning and this party being in power forever. So what you see here, the trade-off is that on the one hand, I have the same party in power, so I can't pick and choose the party depending on what my signal tells me. But on the other hand, I know that this party just follows her preferences because she no longer has electoral incentives. And we have, so what are the findings? We have the findings in the case when the voter is uninformed, and we show that she always strictly prefers elections to being a sole decision maker. Okay, so despite the fact that there are this very strong distortions, she always prefers elections. And when we compare the elections every period to elections once and for all, we can find parameters for which the comparison goes either way. So that's a very underwhelming proposition. Ideally, we would like to tell you what this, give you some substantive findings here, when we want to have longer elections, when we don't, but we don't have that yet. I'm just presenting it here in case you say, oh yeah, I would find it interesting. So maybe you want to work harder on that.
Wioletta, did you also look at the, like a unanimity requirement or majority? Well, here you have 2 parties only. So it is having election by changing the voting rules instead of having one decision maker making decision, to have a unanimity rule.
Yes. So in the first version of the paper, we basically allowed the voter to either choose the left party or the right party, or put them both in power. So require that both have to agree in order to change the policy. And in this simple model, selecting both parties to be in power is equivalent to selecting the party that's aligned with the status quo. Because if the party that's, the veto player that's pivotal will be always the party that's more ideologically aligned with the status quo. So the decision making, so the caveat, we looked at this in a world in which there's no office motivation. So from the voter's perspective, basically, she's indifferent between electing the aligned party and both parties in power. Mm-hmm. So then we had this indeterminacy of voters' decisions, and we just, there was nothing interesting thing to say there. Now, if you do elections like I do here, not every period, but every few periods, then this equivalency breaks down. So here we might have something interesting to say. And also this equivalency will break down if I have more than 2 alternatives. And so we didn't want to sort of make a big deal out of this equivalency, because we knew that this is just, so this is still something that we could think about it for the future if we can handle a little bit.
So it doesn't amplify the status quo bias. So you're saying that it doesn't.
Within this model, no.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, the final finding that we have is the unequal cost of policy change. So we get those questions: what if parties actually don't care about the policy change, the cost of policy change? What if they just care about policies matching the state and their preferences? How would the behavior of the voter change? And vice versa, some people were saying, look, the policy change is costly mainly because of the legislative process. It's like extremely hard to come to the table. You have to negotiate, you have to spend time and so on. So maybe parties actually have a higher cost of policy change. And we can handle that. And basically what we find is that the voter will always try to undo this difference between how much she cares about the cost and the parties. So if the parties don't care about the cost of policy change, the voter will become more status quo biased, meaning there will be more signals for which the voter will just select the party that's aligned with the status quo. And if the parties become less, more concerned about the cost than the voter will actually have a lower status quo bias. She will be more inclined to select the party that's misaligned with the status quo. So I have a formal proposition here, but I will not walk you through the notation here. So when the parties care about stability less, voters' status quo bias increases, and vice versa. Okay, so finally, I just want to spend the last few minutes that I have just talking a little bit about what we are missing, or should we trust our models given that we have only 2 policies? So of course, this restriction to 2 policies is is extremely troubling when you see it for the first time, because we know that that's not world looks like. And the reason why we have this restriction is just tractability. If you have continuum of alternatives, just, you know, the continuation value becomes well behaved, and then you don't even know whether you have equilibria. There is a way to deal with that, but then you lose tractability of the model. You can have like really, at least we were unable to get any reasonable findings. So instead we said, okay, let's just think about a 2-period example and see, you know, what are the changes in the 2-period model from what we've gotten in this extended model. So we look at the simplest utility function. So now the utility depends on the state and on which, as before, which policy is implemented, but this policy Y can be anything on the real line. So we assume here that each voter or each player would like the policy to match the state plus her bias. And just to abstract from curvature, which always, first of all, I don't know what curvature is appropriate when you think about preferences over policies. Second of all, you know, that introduces additional considerations. We just assume that the utility function is the absolute value. The second decision we had to make is what's the cost of policy change? And, you know, it might be increasing the more you change in how much you change the policy. The more you change the policy, the more the costly it is, or it might be constant. But if it's increasing, it might be convex or concave. I don't know. Those are empirical questions, and I don't think there's a good answer to them. So just to keep things simple, we just assume fixed cost of policy change. Okay. And what we get here, we still get the status quo bias, because there's still this effect that, you know, when the voter sees a signal, she's more likely to prefer to keep she's more likely to disagree with the party that's misaligned with the status quo. So we still get the status quo bias very clearly. But how does this affect the behavior of the parties? Well, it's no longer true that the parties will completely polarized, because, you know, if a party selects a policy that's very rightist, very high and rightist, it's very unlikely that tomorrow's state will favor this policy. So it's very likely that tomorrow's state will be something that will make everyone want to change this policy. So if that's the case, this very extreme policy is unlikely to electorally benefit the party that's aligned with this policy. So we are not going to get this complete polarization, but what we can show is that we're going to get 2 points. Let's call it Y star and minus Y star. So they will be on the opposite side of the zero, and parties will distort their policymaking towards these points. So if the state calls for a policy somewhere in between those 2 points, parties will polarize. But if the state calls for a policy, very extreme policy, parties will moderate. So that will be the difference that we found. And
maybe Wioletta, maybe like in these slides, maybe one assumption that if you change the assumption to the fixed cost, if you make the cost of changing the policy a function of the distance of the change, then maybe like a right-wing party would have an incentive to choose a very extreme right-wing policy, so that in a way the voters next time they don't want to suffer the cost of change to a left-wing policy, so they're going to re-elect right-wing, because they think that if they re-elect a left-wing, then it's going to make them suffer such a big change of policy. So maybe when you have the cost is not fixed but is a function of the distance, then of the change, then maybe you can get this strategic polarization, maybe.
Yes, so I have a few things to say here. So first of all, once I make the cost a function of a size of the policy change, I have to, like, my results will depend on whether I make this cost convex and concave. And, you know, when we talk about production function, yes, it should be convex. But when we think about the cost of policy change, it's not obvious to me that it should be convex. If anything, you can think there's a fixed cost and then something else. So if anything, you might think it's concave. And the results will change depending on the curvature. And in fact, everything will depend on the relative curvature of the utility function and the cost function. So there are a lot of things coming here. And then, you know, I'm guessing a lot of weird things will come up depending on which assumption I'm making. And this is I'm not saying this is a not interesting case, but I'm saying A, there will be many findings, and empirically we'll have to figure out which ones are more valid. And B, what would be this is sort of like an orthogonal question. No, this you could ask this question in a world in which the state doesn't change. It's just somehow the, you know, who is in power changes. So we wanted to focus on the responsiveness to the state. So we think we've created the cleanest model that sort of highlights one interesting channel, and then there are additional effects that can complicate it. And finally, so Mark Jackson with like Oriol Tejada and Gersbach, they have series of papers where they play with that a little bit. In a model that's basically a model in which the environment doesn't change, so we get some insight into what happens there from their papers. But I completely agree that, yeah.
We are slowly converging to top of the hour, so yes. If you can do the conclusion slide, and then we'll officially move to the the Q&A.
So just very quickly, the literature. So, you know, I think we talked to the literature about whether elections discipline politicians, and our answer is no. We fit in the literature that sort of shows that policies that looks at questions of what happens when policy chosen today affects whom voter preferred tomorrow. So in our model, endogenously, the policy chosen today will affect whom voter elects tomorrow. We belong to our own literature on the responsiveness to policy changes. And I want to here, you know, give a shout out to Julia. So it seems to us that this idea that policy changes are costly is out there, but has not been really incorporated in a lot of formal modeling on policy making. And only in recent years, people started thinking about it. And Julia is among one of the first ones that actually started thinking about this. So, so we are happy to be in this crowd. So let me just conclude. So I think if I want you to take away something from this model, I would like you to think that if the voter cares about policy responsiveness and stability, then elections will not discipline even office-motivated parties. If anything, parties will behave as if they were more ideologically distant from the voters. So there will be too much policy stability where policy doesn't move with the change, with the state. But at the same time, policy will sometimes move even if the state doesn't call for that. Distortions are more pronounced when the voter actually needs to delegate the most because she's the least informed. And finally, the voter will tend to elect parties that are aligned with the status quo. So in some sense, we get, you know, incumbency advantage, although I didn't talk about this too much throughout the talk, but you can see how this can generate some incumbency advantage. And thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So let's move to the Q&A session. The plan is that we'll start with our panelists first, and then we'll move to the audience questions. Julia, why don't you, if you have any questions or further comments, you can start. We can start with you.
Yeah, so I just want to push the frequency of election a little bit more. I think that was a very nice observation you made, Wioletta, that, you know, you get the in the model, the timing of election corresponds to also the arrival of signals. And this is something I wondered about in general. You know, you elect a party, and they, you know, this happened in Turkey, it happened in the US, and you know, the elected official keeps saying that, well, they elected me, and you know, they gave me the mandate, but in the meantime, the world is changing, right? So you elect them for a fixed period, but you really elect for that time being, and then there are multiple decisions that are made during the period, and maybe voters change their mind already and they are not the right fit. So that's one component, how many signals arrive during the period when you elected that party, how many decisions they need to make. And then there's also the discount factor. So yeah, I think, I don't know what the question is, but I think those are sort of combined, and it would be nice to be able to separate those and think about responsiveness during the term as well. I don't know if you, maybe with a 2-period extension of the model, or 3-period, I guess. It may not be feasible to do the entire analysis for that, but maybe an example to tackle this thing I'm raising.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting what you're saying. So that there's two competing effects. Now, on the one hand, what you said, the time has changed. So I would actually want to have elections right now because I no longer like the person that I've elected. I've elected Republicans, and we have a fiscal crisis, and they are not willing to raise taxes. No, but on the so there's this feeling that I should have elections more frequently. But on the other hand, if I have them frequently, then every period Republicans, when making decisions, think about their re-election prospects, and that they make them even less likely to change taxes. So there are these two effects, and we thought at some point in time this paper, as all our papers, take a long time to get published or get written, but a long time we set up the game as that you're suggesting. Let's say we have elections every second period or every third period. The problem is that the game, within the period, the game is non-stationary because I have 3 periods to the election, 2 periods to the election. So we thought a little bit, and I would like to hear your thoughts of making the game a little bit more, cleaner but less realistic. So basically, that elections are random. In each period, there's a probability P that there will be an election. That makes every period look identical, and then you can vary this P to sort of measure how frequent the elections are. So I don't know how you would feel about a model like this.
I don't know. I'm not a quick thinker, but the thing that immediately comes to my mind is, each period has a number of decisions to be made, some exogenous number of decisions to be made. So if it's an election of 4 years, for example, we have maybe annual decisions and 4 decisions to be made. And every year you get a signal just before that decision. Yeah. And then elections occur every 4th year, and when you are choosing the party, you are not only considering this period's signal, but also think of what might happen during the course of the next 4 years. I don't know, maybe your results are robust, but you can possibly ask additional questions that might make things interesting, like how you vary those things. And like I say, I don't think, what we have seen in Turkey and the US, I don't think the voters really give the mandate for that long when times change, but that seems to be the argument that politicians hang on to. And you might be able to say something to that effect, basically.
Yeah, and you can start guessing, what we would get based on what we have here. So, if making the elections longer somehow decreases these distortions, this voting distortion, this electoral distortion. So making elections longer would make more sense if the parameters are such that these distortions are very large. So, for example, when parties are very patient, then these distortions are really large, and maybe then we want to actually give them longer electoral cycles so that they don't think about elections so much. So we can, we can speculate here, and we used to have some results, but they are very hard to really obtain in the
I mean, I wouldn't go in the infinite horizon to this, but maybe in the 1 period model, you can enlarge it. And
so I say, like, do 1 period model and compare, like 2 period model and compare it to like a 2 period model where you have twice. Maybe,
multiple signals in between. One election, but multiple signals in between. I don't know. Something to think about. But it was very nice. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's go to Alessandro, and then we have in queue Federico from the chat, and I think also after that Helios has a question. So that's the order. Alessandro.
Okay, just a quick. It's a very nice paper. I really like this idea that desire of stability, and then may give you these type 1 errors that you get. It is inefficient policy change. Just maybe a suggestion about the endogeneity of the platforms. So that maybe one thing that you can do, just a suggestion, less complicated than the continuous one, would be what would happen if at time 0 the party, let's say the right-wing party, chooses the location forever. So I mean, it's a one-time choice in which you choose the location. Whether you, so is there an incentive to go towards the to move, in which direction you would have to move? So it would be just a one-time choose, one-time move.
What do you mean they choose they choose the bias forever, their preferences forever, or the policy?
Well, I guess indirectly would then so they would shift the policy R to the right, or to maybe to the center. So this, I guess, indirectly would change the biases. The idea would be to have to make it endogenous in the first period, to make the choice of the location in the first period, and then depending on the choice in the first period, the policies would be the left policy and the policy chosen by the right-wing party. But it's just a suggestion. I don't know if it's feasible, just to see if there is a one-shot deviation for the right-wing party at the beginning to move more or less towards the other policy. So I guess this would look simpler than the continuous, but maybe you can get some intuitions about the incentive to polarize the policy platforms. But just a suggestion. So maybe. We can discuss it later, maybe, but maybe let's give the audience.
I would have to think more about it. We didn't think. So if you are saying, let's just choose B at the beginning of the game, like
sort of. It would be. Do parties have an incentive at least to choose, to commit to some policy ex ante, which is more or less.
Yeah. So when it comes to choosing B, I have to think a little bit about this. I think they would have an incentive to choose B as close to 0 as possible, but I don't know. I have to think about this. But there are other questions that you might be asking related to commitment. So, for example, one can ask: would a party, let's say maybe not once and for all, but at the beginning of the election, would the party want to commit to a particular policy? And the answer is no. Here, the voter likes the fact that the party has flexibility to adjust to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as long as the voter doesn't know the state, the voter likes the fact that the party is uncommitted. So commitment wouldn't help. Of course, commitment to the state-dependent policy function would help. Yes, yeah. And then we would probably get convergence, but that seems to be a little bit too strong to hope for.
Yeah. So cool paper, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, just to remind you, our plan is to stop the recording and the official part of this talk 1/4 the hour, and now we can move to questions from the floor. We had 2 questions in the chat. One of them, there's a follow-up from the question. The other one was answered. So Federico, if you want to unmute yourself and ask or repeat and ask the follow-up.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the presentation. So it's kind of related, not directly, but I was wondering, does the voter benefit from delegation at all in this type of model, given the inefficiency that arises? So if the voter could choose to do like direct democracy, would he prefer to do so or not, or under what conditions? Thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this setup with 2 policies, the answer is yes, she always prefers to delegate. So think about it, to see the intuition, think about this one-shot game, and think about parties that are very, yes. So suppose the voter gets a signal that says, well, I think policy right is better. Okay. So if she were to make her decision, she would choose right. If she instead chooses a party that's aligned with right, she will get right implemented very, very frequently with very high probability, unless the state is really extremely left, in which case she's actually happy that this party goes with left. You see what I mean? So even if the party is extremely biased, because one party is biased towards left, one party is biased towards right, if my signal would make me want to implement policy right, I can instead delegate it to this party that's almost always chooses right, because I know that when this super biased party will not choose right, I actually am happy to side with this party and also not choose right, because that means that the state is really, really leftist. So this flexibility that parties have to adjust to the state is always beneficial to the voters. If this is also true in the model that has continuum of actions, I don't know. We haven't done this. We should do that.
Okay. I think Helios, you have a question. You have a raised hand.
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Hey.
Very nice model. Always signature. Wioletta, elegant models. Always. I loved it. Listen. Yeah. So I was thinking about. I was going to intervene during the discussion with Julia about the frequency of elections. Essentially, you have. The frequency of election is relative to the frequency of the shocks, right? I mean, the first model you have elections and shocks every period, and so that's what that delta represents. And now you're trying to disentangle these two things. And I like the idea of having somehow the elections be random. That could be a way to make it stationary. And could you make it stationary if you do it the other way? If elections are every period, but then, shocks are random in a sense with probability P, there's a change there's a new state. If we're predicting 1 minus P, the state stays the same. And so you don't need, which seems realistic because there should be some kind of persistence in the state, you'd think. And that also represents the frequency of the elections relative to the state, in a sense, because it's one relative to how frequent it is relative to the other. That kind of models the same thing. But maybe it doesn't work now, I'm thinking, because then you have a state variable that's the state that you don't have, you don't want to keep track of. Maybe I'm just thinking aloud here. Okay, love to hear.
Viola, before you answer, let me thank everyone for the participations. We reached more than a quarter past, so this is when we stop the recording. But please stay along and listen. Let's listen to Viola's answer, and we will have a discussion afterwards. Thank you.